One neat thing that we can do with Spring and JPA is we can essentially create databases on the fly based on our DTOs. So in this video, we're going to see how we can start to set that up. First of all, I already have a MySQL database that I've put together. Oops, we'll take a look at that over here. So MySQL database that I've put together, the name of the database is plants, and I also have a user called admin. So I need to configure that in my Spring Boot application. So for that, I'm going to go to Source Main Resources, and I'm going to go to this Application Properties file, which is essentially the overall properties file for our entire application. I'll start by adding a few entries here. Spring.jpa.hibernate.ddl-auto equals create. We have several options here. Create means to create the database every time. We can also do a create drop, which means create the database and then drop it when the session factory closes. We can do an update, which means that we will update the database to match essentially our DTOs. And then none means no changes to the database structure. And none is the most common. Next, we'll say Spring. Whoops, need to put that on a new line, just a moment. So we'll say Spring data source URL equals, and now we need to use a JDBC compliant URL, which is JDBC:MySQL, a fairly common JDBC URL we're starting with, // Now the host where this database lives, it happens to live locally, so I could either do 127.0.0.1 or just localhost. The port. By default, the port is 3306 in MySQL. I went ahead and left that when I created it. I left it as is. We'll do 3306. And then the database name, and we said that's going to be plants. Let me go ahead and zoom in so we can see this in high definition. Next, I'm going to say spring.datasource.username equals, and then we'll say the username I created earlier, which is admin. And then spring.datasource.password, and then I'll use my super secret, super secure password. If you haven't guessed it yet, you get to see it now. Snoopy14+. Now we need to configure our project to use Spring JPA, which is fairly straightforward to do. We'll start with our dependencies. So I'm going to go to my POM file, and we'll scroll down to the dependencies section, and I'll add a couple more dependencies here. So we'll start with dependency. And of course, many times this is easy to find off the internet, or you can just take a look at my GitHub where I'll publish this. So we'll say group ID and let that terminate. And for this, we'll say MySQL. And then after that, we'll say artifact ID. Artifact ID, just like so. And we'll say MySQL connector Java. Just like so. Also, we need to add the JPA syntax. So I'll add one more dependency tag, just like so. And then within this, we'll say group ID. And we'll say org.springframework.boot. And after that, we'll say artifact ID. And inside here, we'll say Spring. Oh, shoot. Off by just a little bit. Artifact ID, we'll say Spring boot starter data JPA, just like so. So a couple new dependencies, and then we save. I'm going to, since I typed that all out from scratch, and I made a couple typos in there while I was typing, I'm just going to make a final check here, make sure everything looks like it looks good. That I and ID for group ID and artifact ID should be uppercase. There shouldn't be a dash between the two. So I think we're pretty good right now. Spring Boot Starter JPA looks good, and MySQL Connector Java looks good. The group ID is fine. Org Spring Framework Boot. Okay, this all looks good. So now, just for good measure, right-click, and we'll do a Maven update to grab any libraries in case it didn't grab them already. Give that just a moment. And OK. And then I'm going to go to our DTO. And what I need to do is I need to say, this is a DTO that I want to save. I want to make a table that looks a lot like this DTO. So above the specimen DTO, I'm going to add an @entity annotation. And in the language of Spring, we know it does things in a fairly straightforward manner and usually in an annotation manner. So this is what we need to do to say, hey, this is a bean that I wish to persist. So let's go ahead and import this one. I will use the JavaX persistence import. There we go. And now we see it recognizes that entity annotation. If you don't get those import options, make sure your POM is up to date. Make sure you've added those 2 entries that I just added. Now, underneath this, we're going to say and ID. And I've put that above the specimen ID attribute because I'm saying this is going to be my identifying column. So let's go ahead and import our persistence again. And then after that, we'll do one more annotation. We'll say @generated value and strategy equals generation type. Whoops. One second. Generation type. .auto. So these are things that we previously would do at the database level, but now what we're saying is, hey, Spring Boot and JPA, I want you to figure out how to automatically generate a specimen ID for me. You see there are a couple other options we have, identity, sequence, and table. For us, auto is going to work fine. And save. And you see it found all that for us. Now we simply need to import this generated value. Okay. After that, one more thing that we need to do, we simply need to make what's called a repository. So a repository is an interface that we create, and it's kind of interesting because we make an interface that extends another interface. Now listen carefully to that. An interface that extends another interface. When we hear interface, we tend to think of a class implementing an interface. And we know that an interface is essentially a list of methods. So when we say one interface extends another interface, what you end up with is you end up with essentially a sub-interface that is a sum of all of the methods in itself and the interface that it's extending, and so on and so forth. Now, this repository is essentially a DAO. So I'm going to go to our DAO package. I'm going to choose New and Interface. And we will call this one, let's call it we'll call it Specimen Repository. And Extended Interface, take a look at that. You see we're not the first one to ever extend an interface. So Extended Interface is going to be CrudRepository, just like so. And then we choose Finish. Now this is kind of interesting because magic happens here. And the magic is that it automatically creates an implementation of this interface. All we have to do is we have to define the interface like we've done here. And then Spring says, okay, I know what I need to do. I can make an implementation of this interface. We do have to give it a bit of information though. First of all, what's this T? The T is what we are saving, which is going to be a specimen DTO, and that's the magic of generic types. The next one is what we're using is an identifier type, which is going to be an integer. We use the class representation, the auto-boxed or actually what gets auto-boxed representation. So whoops, Control Z, and we'll make it integer, just like so. Now, specimen DTO is in a different package, so we're going to need to do an import here, and then we should be all set from there. So import specimen DTO. Okay, and we have our specimen repository. Now, what do we do next? Okay, let's take a look at our current DAOs. And I do have an iSpecimen DAO, and what's going on there? Well, it has a save method. So let's go ahead and implement this. So I'll say new. I'll tell you what, we'll just go up here and we'll say right-click new and class, and we'll say specimen DAO and interfaces, and we'll add our specimen iSpecimen DAO. One nice thing about Eclipse, if you type just with capital letters, it will select only types, or in other words, classes or files that have those capital letters. So with a long list like the one I just had, I can just type ISDAO, there we go, boom, like so, and finish. Okay, now here's where things are going to get a bit interesting. Remember, this is called specimen repository. Okay, what do we do next? Let's go into this DAO, and let's say specimen repository. Specimen repository. So remember, this is Spring Boot, and many times what we can do is we can define a variable like so, and then we can simply make it auto-wired. Okay, and a little Control-Shift-O magic, or we can just click over here, and oh, didn't like that, did it? Okay, no worries, we'll go ahead and save, and we'll borrow an import from somewhere else. We can just run up to our, I'll tell you what, we will just double click here, and I know we have auto-wired in our controller, so let's see if we can borrow it from there. Okay, here we go. And Control-C. And perhaps I just misspelled it. That looks good. Okay. And enter. And save. Okay, and that took care of it. Hey, just need a little extra kick, but there we go. That took care of it. Let's take a look at the save method now. And here's where things get really interesting. So specimen repository, let's access that variable that I've created above. Control-space to autocomplete. And what methods do we have available to us? Holy smokes, look at all these methods. And take a look, there's one called save. Okay, so I double click on save, and what's save going to take? A specimen DAO, or DTO rather. And terminate with the semicolon, and save. And everything compiles. It's just magic. Now, once again, I have to reinforce something here. Forgive me for being a bit repetitive, but specimen repository, what's that? We just made it. It's this interface. But you see, you don't see any methods on this interface. But they're coming from upstairs. They're coming from this thing called CrudRepository. And CrudRepository, I was hoping to be able to jump into that. Let's see if we can. There we go. Note that what it's doing here is it has defined a number of methods. And these methods are using generic identifiers. So one of the generic identifiers is that ID that we used earlier, which is find by ID. So if I want to say, look up the specimen by ID, I simply have to pass in the integer that represents that specimen's primary key, and it will return back to me a matching specimen. Now, we also take a look at this save. So you see save, it says S extends from T. Now, what's T? T is the very first generic identifier that we passed in. That generic identifier is specimen DTO. So behind the scenes, what we're doing here, when we pass in these generic identifiers here, we're giving the correct parameter type and return type to methods that are defined up in CrudRepository. And so for that reason, we don't need any extra methods in our specimen repository extension of CrudRepository. On the same note, behind the scenes, Spring is smart enough to know how to provide an implementation for each of those methods. And on the same note again, this is an interface. And remember what polymorphism is. Polymorphism says variable type tells you what methods you're allowed to call. Object type tells you what will happen when you call those methods. A variable type can be an interface, but an object type cannot be an interface because an object type or an interface rather, does not have method implementations. But behind the scenes, Spring is making that object type for us. And because we're using auto-wired, it knows to take that object type and to throw it into the specimen repository variable. So now this method is available to us. Now all we need to do to test things out is to pass the specimen DTO in. We'll want to wire this up to our controller class. But I'll tell you what, just because we're on a roll here, I'd like to kind of give this a quick and dirty and go ahead and just try out saving a generic specimen. So I'm going to run to our controller. Let's see, do we want to... I should probably wire this up through the specimen service as well. Let me go ahead and do that. Yeah, because I'm halfway there with the specimen service. So So remember, we have our controller, which is handling button clicks from the user interface. Then the controller calls down to a service, which is essentially business logic, and also aggregating together DAOs. And then the DAO is where we're doing persistence. So you see here in specimen service, we're auto-wiring in a plant DAO. Let's go ahead and add in auto-wired again. And let's say iSpecimen service, and then specimen service. Oh, sorry, specimen DAO. iSpecimen DAO, and then specimen DAO, which is essentially the, we just made a class that implements this interface. Remember, just a few moments ago, we just made this class. So we're taking this class from the DAO layer, and we're wiring it up one layer above to the service layer. Now we have enough to provide an implementation for the save method. So in the save method, we'll say specimen DAO, and then guess what? .save, and we'll pass this specimen DTO object straight down from the service layer down to the DAO. Okay, now we need to call the service layer from the controller. If I take a look at the controller, I already have an endpoint defined that we can start to use. Now I'm going to go ahead and just dummy up a specimen here. So we'll say specimen DTO .set description, and we'll say a great eastern redbud. Okay. And then set plant ID 13. Actually, I think redbud is 83 in plant places. Again, I'm hard coding this, but as long as we can prove out this concept, we can wire it up to our user interface and actually gather some data from the user. So let's call set latitude, and we'll use my Cincinnati latitude of 39.74. Whoops. And then we'll say specimen DTO.set longitude. And once again, we'll use my we'll use my Cincinnati longitude of -84.51. If you're from Cincinnati, that number might ring a bell to you, probably more so than 39.74. If you're curious, Google it, and it will make sense very quickly. Okay, I think we're in good shape here. Specimen ID we're not going to set because that's going to auto-generate. Now I ran this and I got an exception, error creating bean with name entity manager factory. Did a quick search on that and got some results very quickly. It looks like I'm not the only one to have this. It's a bit particular to the version of Java that I'm running. It can be fixed quite simply by just adding another POM entry, another POM dependency. So I'm going to say dependency, and then I'm going to say group ID again, just like I did before. And we'll say javax.xml.bind. And then we'll say, go to the end here. And there we go, almost. And then we'll say artifact ID and JAXB API. And then we'll say version. And the latest version is good. I just happen to see 230, so we'll save. I do know of one other change that I need to make, and that's the specimen DAO. I have the auto wired, but you know what I didn't do is I did not say that this is a component. So let's go ahead and add the component annotation. And just a moment, save. So remember that for auto wired, it's going to look for a class with a component annotation, which is the same type as the variable type, or a subclass of the variable type, or a class that implements an interface, where the interface is the variable type. So needs to set up this relationship. Now I know we've gone through a lot of changes here, quite a few things going on, and actually one thing, sorry, I know I keep saying one more thing, but one more thing I noticed I didn't do is on the save specimen endpoint, I'm not calling down to the specimen service. This is from the controller to the service. So let's add that call. Specimen service, which is the variable that I've defined on line 33. And then we'll say save. And then we're going to pass in the specimen DTO that we've just created. This will be a lot easier. Let's see, add throws declaration. No, let's not do that. Let's not do that. Let's take away the throws declaration, and let's wrap this in a try catch block, and let's have the catch block say log.error, and we'll say error saving specimen, okay, and E. So we know we always want to do some logging in a catch block. This is no different. Return error. So we'll return an error page, but we'll also log the exception details. So, okay, and one more minor change, just because this is going to be much easier to visualize in the debugger, where we can look at it step by step. On the same note, I know I'm really verbosely logging here, so I'm going to change my logging level on the console to something a little bit higher than trace. Let's go ahead and change this back to info. So anyway, lots of hoops we're jumping through, from the save specimen endpoint to the service to the DAO to the database. So let's visualize it the best way to visualize it, and that is through the debugger. So I go ahead and debug Java application, and we'll let this guy start up. Looking fairly good so far, not getting any error messages or anything. So let's go to the start endpoint and just make sure the application comes up, and it does come up. Now we know the application's running, and we know that we're going to kick everything off with the save specimen endpoint, which is in our controller class. Remember, controller, model view controller. This is what handles things like button clicks and endpoints and the like. Controller calls down to the service, service calls to the DAO, DAO calls down to all of this JPA magic, which is what I want to walk through in the debugger so we can put all of this together. So let's change this endpoint from start to save specimen, and that's what we called it, right? Yeah, save specimen, all lowercase. So save specimen. Our debugger hits, which is a good sign. Now let's switch to debug. Okay, and we take a look, and we're creating our specimen DTO. Let's go ahead and step over each of these. So simply populating a plain old Java object, you see a Great Eastern Redbud 3974 minus 8451, plant ID 83. Now we're going to step into this call to the service layer, from the controller to the service. That's a very quick call because that calls right down to the DAO layer. Step into the DAO, and here's our specimen repository. Stepping into this is not going to make a whole lot of sense because that's all the generated stuff that Spring gives to us. So I'm simply going to step over. We'll give it just a moment here. And after just a moment, it steps over that. It does not throw an exception, which is an awfully good sign. So we'll step return, and then we'll say, okay, keep going. Again, no exception caught. It's just going to return the start endpoint. Now here's the real test. Let's go back to our PHP MyAdmin, our MySQL. Remember, before we did all this, this is what it looked like. No tables found in the database. What happens now when we click on the database? Holy smokes, take a look at this. We have a table called specimen DTO. That didn't exist before. We click on that, and what's in the table called specimen DTO? A Great Eastern Redbud. Specimen ID 1, description of Great Eastern Redbud, latitude 3974, longitude minus 8451, plant ID 83. We didn't create any of this ourselves. We did it through our application, and we let Spring JPA create it for us. So a whole lot of stuff going on here, but the cool thing is you see that we can actually create the entire schema just by using some Spring annotations and some properties. Now, do we always want to do that? Well, ask a data architect, and they will probably tell you no, that you want to think about what the data architecture is going to look like, and then you want to have the application match that architecture. We can do that as well. That's no problem. We just need to tweak some of our properties and our application properties file, so we can certainly match up to an existing database. And many times when we're writing an application, we're going to write it to a database that already exists. But nonetheless, you see, if you just want a place to store stuff, which is really what microservices are all about, just have a little place to store stuff, this is a nice way to have that database schema get generated on the fly and have everything persisted on the fly. And less than half an hour, not bad. So I hope this video has been helpful.